ADHD is not what doctors told you. It is somewhere between 6 and 8% of every human population on Earth has a brain that cannot pay attention. That is the story most people know. The distracted student, the forgetful adult, the person who cannot finish anything they start, who loses their keys every morning, who sits down to work and emerges 4 hours later, having done everything except the thing they sat down to do. That story is real, but it is less than half the picture. Because the same brain that cannot sit through a meeting can enter a state of focus so total, so consuming, so extraordinarily productive that it outperforms neurotypical brains by almost every measurable standard. The same brain that forgets appointments and loses wallets is statistically overrepresented among founders of companies, emergency room physicians, special forces soldiers, and some of the most creatively prolific individuals in the history of human achievement. ADHD has been described, studied, medicated, and managed as a deficit for over a century. What the most recent neuroscience is revealing is that this framing, the deficit model, the disorder model, the model that has shaped every classroom, every workplace policy, and every conversation most ADHD people have ever had about themselves, is not just incomplete. It may be precisely wrong. And the implications of getting it right change everything about how this brain should be understood, managed, and most importantly, used. In 2021, the World Federation of ADHD published an international consensus statement signed by 80 of the world's leading ADHD researchers across 6 continents. It was the most comprehensive summary of ADHD science ever assembled. Its opening conclusion was unambiguous. ADHD is not a myth. It is not overdiagnosed. It is not the result of bad parenting, poor diet, or too much screen time. It is one of the most heritable conditions in all of medicine, with genetic contributions estimated between 74 and 80%, more heritable than height, more heritable than most physical diseases. And its name is almost entirely wrong. ADHD does not involve a deficit of attention. People with ADHD have a normal, in many cases superior, capacity for attention. What they have is a deficit of attention regulation. The difference between those two things is the difference between having no legs and having legs that only run at full speed. The ADHD brain does not have less attention than a neurotypical brain. It has attention that it cannot modulate on demand. It cannot reliably direct focus toward what is important. It can only direct focus toward what is interesting, urgent, novel, or emotionally compelling. That single distinction between a deficit of attention and a deficit of attention regulation changes the entire picture of what ADHD is, what it is capable of, and what it would take to work with it instead of against it. At its neurological core, ADHD is primarily a disorder of the dopamine system. Dopamine is the brain's primary signal for motivation, reward anticipation, and sustained effort. When you work toward a goal and expect a reward, dopamine rises and drives the behavior forward. This is the system that allows neurotypical people to do boring work because they know the reward, the paycheck, the grade, the approval of a boss, is coming eventually. In 2009, Dr. Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the NIH, published a landmark study in JAMA using PET scanning technology to directly compare dopamine signaling in ADHD and non-ADHD brains. The findings were clear. ADHD brains show significantly lower dopamine receptor availability in the reward and motivation circuits of the brain, particularly in the nucleus accumbens and the midbrain. The signal that tells a neurotypical brain that boring work is worth doing because a reward is coming is significantly weaker in the ADHD brain. This is not laziness. It is not a choice. It is a structural difference in the neurochemistry of motivation. The ADHD brain is not unmotivated. It is unmotivated by the same things that motivate other brains. Importance does not move it. Deadlines do not move it until they are immediate and inescapable. What moves it is interest, passion, novelty, challenge, urgency, and competition. This is why an ADHD person can spend 8 hours obsessively building something they love and cannot spend 20 minutes on something they find tedious, even when the tedious thing is the one that matters more. The brain is not broken. It is running on a different fuel, and most modern environments are not stocked with that fuel. In 1993, author and researcher Tom Hartman proposed a framework that has since attracted serious scientific attention. He called it the hunter versus farmer hypothesis. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, the hundreds of thousands of years before agriculture, human survival depended on hunting, constant environmental scanning, rapid response to novelty, hyper-focus on prey, impulsive action when opportunity appeared, high-risk tolerance, boredom with repetitive tasks, an inability to sit still and do nothing when something interesting might be happening elsewhere. Every trait that makes ADHD debilitating in a modern office is a trait that would have made its carrier an extraordinarily effective hunter. Agriculture changed the requirements. Farming rewards patience, routine, planning across seasons, sustained effort on repetitive tasks, and deferred gratification on a timescale of months. Every trait that makes a good farmer is a trait the ADHD brain struggles with by design. The school system rewards farmer traits. The corporate workplace rewards farmer traits. Sit still, follow instructions, produce consistent output on a schedule someone else designed. The ADHD brain was not built for this environment, and the evidence suggests it was never supposed to be. A 2006 study published in the American Journal of Human Biology examined the ADHD-associated gene variant DRD4-7R in the Ariel people of Kenya, a nomadic community that retained traditional hunter-gatherer practices. Among nomadic Ariel men, carriers of DRD4-7R were better nourished and showed higher status than non-carriers. Among settled Ariel men in the same population, carriers of the same gene variant showed lower nutritional status and poorer outcomes. The same genetic variant, two different environments, two opposite outcomes. ADHD is not a broken brain in the wrong body. It is a hunter brain in a farmer's world. In 2019, a peer-reviewed study published in the journal ADHD Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorders formally documented something that ADHD people had been describing for decades, but that mainstream psychiatry had largely dismissed as anecdote: hyperfocus. The state in which an ADHD brain locks onto something it finds compelling and enters a level of concentrated, sustained, deeply absorbed attention that neurotypical people rarely, if ever, achieve. The researchers found that hyperfocus was reported by the overwhelming majority of ADHD adults in their sample. It was not random. It was consistently triggered by the same conditions: high interest, high novelty, creative challenge, and intrinsic motivation. And its characteristics were striking. Time perception during hyperfocus collapses entirely. Hours pass as minutes. External distractions cease to register. The quality of output produced during hyperfocus states frequently exceeds anything the same person produces during normal concentrated effort. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who spent his career studying peak performance states, described the optimal state for creative and productive work as flow, a condition of total absorption in a challenging, intrinsically rewarding task. Most people achieve flow rarely and unpredictably. The ADHD brain, under the right conditions, enters flow states routinely, automatically, involuntarily, with an intensity that non-ADHD brains require years of deliberate meditation practice to approach. The problem is not that the ADHD brain cannot focus. The problem is that it cannot choose what it focuses on. It cannot focus on demand. It can only focus on what it finds genuinely compelling. And the moment that compulsion ends, the focus vanishes completely. In 2006, psychologists Holly White and Preeti Shah at the University of Michigan published a controlled study examining creativity in adults with and without ADHD. They administered standardized tests of divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple novel solutions to open-ended problems, to ADHD and non-ADHD participants under identical conditions. The ADHD group significantly outperformed the non-ADHD group on measures of creative thinking, originality, and the ability to make unusual associations. This finding has been replicated. The ADHD brain's tendency to make rapid, uninhibited connections between seemingly unrelated ideas, the same tendency that makes it difficult to stay on one topic in conversation, is also what drives genuinely original thinking. It is not a coincidence that ADHD is dramatically overrepresented among entrepreneurs. A 2019 study by researchers Johan Wiklund and Holger Patzelt at Syracuse University and TU Munich found that entrepreneurs are significantly more likely to have ADHD than the general population, and that specific ADHD traits, including high novelty seeking, impulsivity, and hyper-focused passion for new ideas, directly predict entrepreneurial success. Richard Branson, Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, John Chambers, who built Cisco into one of the most valuable companies in history, all have publicly described symptoms consistent with ADHD. The pattern is not that ADHD people succeed despite their neurology. The research suggests they succeed in certain environments and certain roles, partly because of it. None of this means ADHD is easy, or that the difficulty has been exaggerated, or that the people who have spent their lives struggling with it simply needed a better attitude. The data on the cost of untreated or unsupported ADHD is among the most sobering in all of psychiatry. Dr. Russell Barkley at the Medical University of South Carolina, one of the most published ADHD researchers in the world, has documented across decades of research that untreated ADHD is associated with significantly elevated rates of academic failure, relationship breakdown, unemployment, substance use, and accident injury. Adults with undiagnosed or unsupported ADHD earn less across their lifetimes. They are more likely to be fired, divorced, and involved in serious accidents. They experience dramatically higher rates of anxiety and depression, not as primary conditions, but as the accumulated psychological consequence of spending years, sometimes decades, believing they are lazy, stupid, or fundamentally broken because they cannot do things that seem effortless for everyone around them. Barkley has described ADHD as fundamentally a disorder of time, specifically of the ability to use time effectively. The ADHD brain lives almost entirely in the present moment. It experiences time as now and not now. Future consequences, no matter how serious, have minimal motivational pull until they become immediate. This is why the ADHD person who genuinely wants to complete a task cannot start it until the deadline is close enough to feel real. Not because they don't care, because their brain's future is neurologically further away than a neurotypical person's. The shame that accumulates around this, the lifetime of being told, "You could do it if you tried," is one of the most damaging and least discussed aspects of what it means to have this brain in this world. Here is what the research actually says about maximizing productivity with an ADHD brain, and it is almost entirely different from conventional productivity advice. Conventional productivity advice is built for neurotypical brains. Make a to-do list, prioritize by importance, work in structured blocks, maintain a routine. For ADHD brains, this advice is at best ineffective and at worst actively harmful, because it is built on the assumption that importance drives motivation. In the ADHD brain, it does not. What the evidence supports instead is designing environments and systems that provide the neurological conditions the ADHD brain requires to function. The first is external accountability. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Attention Disorders found that ADHD adults showed dramatically improved task completion rates when working in the presence of another person, a phenomenon called body doubling. The other person does not need to help, supervise, or even engage. Their mere presence is enough to regulate the ADHD nervous system and provide sufficient external stimulation to sustain focus. The second is exercise. Neuropsychiatrist John Rady at Harvard Medical School has documented extensively that aerobic exercise produces immediate and significant improvements in executive function, working memory, and attention in ADHD populations. Effects comparable in some studies to stimulant medication. The mechanism is direct. Exercise raises dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, the exact neurotransmitters that ADHD medication targets pharmacologically. The third, and perhaps most important, is interest engineering. Rather than fighting the interest-based motivation system and trying to force the ADHD brain to care about what is important, the most effective approach is to engineer genuine interest into the tasks that need doing. Novelty, competition, stakes, creative constraints, time pressure, turning necessary work into a game, a challenge, a race, not as a trick, but as a legitimate neurological accommodation for a brain that was simply built to respond to a different set of signals than the ones most workplaces provide. An estimated 75 to 80% of adults with ADHD were never diagnosed as children. They spent their entire educations being assessed against a standard their neurology was never built to meet. They received feedback from teachers, from parents, from themselves, that they were disorganized, underachieving, difficult, lazy. They developed sophisticated coping mechanisms that masked their symptoms well enough to pass through childhood without ever receiving an accurate explanation for why everything was harder for them than it appeared to be for everyone else. Girls with ADHD are particularly likely to be missed. The hyperactive presentation of ADHD, the one that fills classrooms with disruption, is more common in boys. Girls more often present with inattentive ADHD, the daydreamer, the quiet underachiever, the girl who is never a problem because her chaos is entirely internal. She's not disrupting anyone. She is simply drowning in silence. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that girls with ADHD receive their diagnosis an average of 5 years later than boys with equivalent symptom severity. 5 additional years of struggling without explanation. 5 additional years of accumulating the shame that comes from failing repeatedly at things that no one has yet told you. Your brain was never designed to do easily. The ADHD brain is not a neurotypical brain with something missing. It is a different kind of brain entirely, with different strengths, different limitations, different fuel requirements, and a fundamentally different relationship with time, interest, motivation, and focus. It was shaped by a long period of human history in which its traits were not liabilities, in which the ability to scan constantly for novelty, to hyper-focus on a target at the expense of everything else, to act impulsively when opportunity appeared, to find routine unbearable and be driven by that discomfort to keep moving, were precisely the traits that kept people fed and alive. The world changed faster than evolution could follow. The classroom, the office, the 40-hour structured work week arrived in an evolutionary eye blink, and the hunter brain found itself sitting under fluorescent lights, being asked to fill in spreadsheets. The diagnosis is not the problem. The problem is the conclusion most people draw from it. What the research suggests instead is that the most productive thing an ADHD brain can do is stop fighting its own operating system. Stop trying to force interest where there is none. Interest, novelty, stakes, movement, external structure, creative freedom, problems worthy of hyperfocus. The hunter brain is not broken. It is waiting for the right environment. And for the first time in the history of this diagnosis, the science exists to help build one.